Paul would then conclude was from some bygone time and inimitable. Nevertheless, because the present form of the canonical portrayal insists that the command is God's, these ideological readings only move the moral problem into the realm of historical reconstruction, geared to a speculative single audience intention, a sympathetic reading, though they may be, and indeed may be right. God's character, however, in such a retrospective understanding, remains God's character all the same. Now, a subset of this reading has been proposed by Georg Breulich. He argues that there are exilic additions in Deuteronomy 6, 17 to 19, and 11, 22 to 25, and that these don't mention the destruction of the Canaanites. Returning exiles, his proposed audience, would see that the chapters which look ahead to a time after punishment, that is, return from dispersion and exile, also fail to mention destruction of the Canaanites, and indeed see the Gibeonites, for example, included in the covenant. This reading requires a very subtle understanding of the intended audience, and while it does underscore features we should not miss in the canonical portrayal, it, however, ignores the fact that canonical literature in its very nature resists this kind of specific temporal fixation and single audience intention. It's a point worth stressing that chapters of the present Deuteronomy, leaving aside these historical reconstructions, in chapters 28 following do look ahead to Israel's punishment. The law killed, to use Luther's language of second use. To the degree it did not kill the Canaanites, we learn it killed Israel. And this is a point I want to return to in a moment. The final form of Deuteronomy, then, does not leave us with the impression that what Israel failed to do, it must try harder and do again when it returns from exile. Because the canonical presentation of Deuteronomy seeks a wider temporal frame of reference, it also tells us that it is written for ensuing generations. These generations are anticipated in their own right, including us, and the vocation laid upon them is to learn from the lessons of disobedience, not to return to the starting point and imitate the vocation laid upon a generation now past. That is, the canonical form of Deuteronomy handles the question of subsequent audiences in its own right, and not simply as grist for historical reconstructions. By contrast, note how differently the canonical form deals with the vocation set before ensuing generations when it comes to the Decalogue. In chapter 6, the rhetorical point is almost overstated. Moses says the law was given, or God says through him the law was given not to the old fathers, but to you. You here today, all of you, that is the generation that will enter the promised land. The law is as much theirs as the first generations, and more so, for that first generation died in the wilderness because they did not obey. This present generation is in a new spot, and so capable of obedience. When we move to the final chapters of Deuteronomy, we see that the new generation failed as well. So the point is reasserted again. Now it is said that the law is not too hard. It can be done, and indeed provision for obedience is a special gift God intends on the other side of punishment. Return and repent, and God will hear from heaven. It's the way it is put. God has set down a law demanding obedience, and he's also understood that it will raise up as well as kill, because in time it will kill. How can the righteous provision of the law remain what it is, and the character of God is righteous, and yet Israel be forgiven and granted new life? Deuteronomy, in its final canonical form, is about trying to answer this kind of deep theological question. And the same question sits over vast swaths of the Old Testament in its canonical presentation, including how God can be this God with the nations outside the covenant, slow to anger and of great compassion, yet by no means clearing the guilty. I want to return to this at a later point. Thus far, we've been trying to understand the rhetorical presentation of canon and conquest in its canonical form, but we would be remiss, I think, to leave out mention of a further modern scholarly option for interpretation. This option can be tied up with more conservative estimates of the historicality of the narratives in question, and so a refusal to assign them to later sources. That is, the canonical portrayal of Deuteronomy and Joshua was not an idealized account, but a real account of affairs. God would drive out the Canaanites because of the danger they represented to Israel as they came out of Egypt. The canonical perspective would recall the Canaanites as the sons of Ham, whose sexualized humiliation of Noah is recorded in Genesis 15, which we heard about from a different angle, that key text in Genesis earlier. The worship practices of these Canaanites and their colleagues was tied up with sexualized accounts of the nature of God and of the consequence of this, if prophets like Hosea are to be interpreted, was a manipulation of sexuality, the rhythms of nature, and a gross distortion of what it means for God to be God, creator of male and female, and not somehow ontologically enclosed within a cultic reenactment of that, invoked to ensure fertility. The worship practices of the Canaanites not only paid tribute to this understanding of the gods, but involved worshipers in such rites via imitation. But however one understands, and it's a bit of a mystery, the history of religion dimension, the canonical presentation does not hide from this fact as a major index for why the Canaanites are to be so treated. The Canaanites and their religion would be a snare. They are described as haters of God. Israel would be commanded to live into God's decision to drive them out, and much of the idealized character of the actual practice of harem surely is intended to underscore that God is working his righteous will out, rather than a well-equipped and superior army is defeating foes in the way this happens in ways familiar to us. The exceptions, Rahab, the Gibeonites, as with the Ninevites in Jonah or the Moabite Ruth, are reminders that the Lord, compassionate and merciful, is the Lord of all the earth, and so refuses to turn the nations into stereotyped non-Israelites. In the words of Amos, "You only have I known of all the nations of the earth, therefore I will punish you for your iniquities." A judgment more sustained and more comprehensive than the litany of nations preceding in Amos 1 and 2, precisely because of God's electing of a special people with a special accountability before him and the nations both. Now, the benefit of this conservative historical account is that the canonical portrayal is retained. As we have seen, even reconstructions that argue that the harem project is retrojected from a later context of concern really only defer the moral question of God's character. The canonical approach argues that later editors defer to the narrative form in which their secondary elaborations are made. On this understanding, even a later editor does not seek to address only a single audience at a specific point in time, but uses the full canonical form in its present shape so as to speak meaningfully, if complicatedly, about harem, God's character, and other matters. A sophisticated canonical reading is able to comprehend a wider range of theological penetration in which several things are probably going on all at the same time. So on the one hand, the seriousness of the problem of Canaanite religion and practice is not eliminated, but the idea that a later editor sought to focus on Israel's disobedience in ways that are familiar from the perspective of Deuteronomic theology, and so paid particular attention to the problems that would result in time by failure to deal with false religion, is also there in the account. The plausibility of this view can be seen by attending to the wider canonical perspectives. That is, the so-called Deuteronomistic redaction is itself an effort to understand the implications of disobedience as the march of history plays itself out under God's patience and providence. Israel is finally sent into exile. We know this in Deuteronomy. And previous generations were lost in a vortex of disobedience. And one central reason for that was their involvement in religious practices that eroded a sense of God's character, his revealed will, so that what he had intended as blessing became curse, to use the language of Deuteronomy. The canonical portrayal does not focus on a God with a happy face for Israel and a stern face for everyone else, but insists that idolatry is a kind of form of death and that God desires life. Its attention to the larger canonical portrayal, including New Testament statements, which say the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah is only a mild case of punishment in comparison with what the gospel will expose, that governed the perspective of early church interpreters. Reflexively, they reacted to harem as a subset of God's holiness. They assumed an account of final causes that permitted them to speak of counsels secret to God alone without being mystical about it, within which his dispensations of blessing and curse would unfold in time. God could change his mind. They understood that episodes of punishment, as these unfolded in Deuteronomy and Joshua, constituted real events in past time, though their understanding of them did not move to the level of imitation or identification simply with the mind of God. Again, the complexity of the canonical portrayal likely guarded them from this reflex. Israel itself had been condemned and killed by the law meant to give life when all was said and done. So the moral lesson they drew was not that holy war was something one ought to go out and do better, but rather that it somehow exposed the darkness in the human heart, whether in the form of false religion and idolatry or in the form of a failure to live as God commanded and desired, and so to be brought before his character as the one who kills and brings alive, the Lord compassionate and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Ironically, precisely in God's judgment of his own people, Isaiah would claim, would the knowledge of him be communicated to the nations through their punishment. It is these larger canonical notes, I think, that prevented the church fathers from thinking that herem was something belonging to a bygone age when God's delivered eccentric commands, precisely because the heart of the New Testament's message was in accordance with the deep mystery of God's justice and mercy as revealed in the Old Covenant and brought to climax in the cross and empty tomb.